December 19th, 1944, 1100 hours. A conference room in the French city of Verdun, where 26 years earlier, over 300,000 men had died in trenches that still scarred the surrounding hills. The building was a former French barracks, cold and drafty despite efforts to heat it. Maps covered the walls, showing the current situation in Belgium. Red pins marked German positions. Blue pins marked American forces. The gap between them was growing wider every hour. Outside, military vehicles filled the courtyard. Dispatch riders waited on motorcycles, ready to carry orders across France. Brigadier General Halley Maddox stood near the back wall of that room, watching his commanding general walk toward a chair at the conference table. Maddox was 45 years old, 3rd Army's operations officer, the man responsible for translating Patton's orders into actual troop movements. Patton had promoted him to general just 5 weeks earlier, removing stars from his own shoulders during the ceremony. For 7 days straight, Maddox had worked with almost no sleep. His hands were stained with ink from marking maps. His eyes burned from studying terrain charts under dim electric lights. He had driven through the night from Luxembourg to reach Verdun in time for this meeting. Sitting at that table were the men who would decide whether the war in Europe continued or collapsed. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, 12th Army Group Commander Omar Bradley, 3rd Army Commander George Patton. Also present were Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, and Major General Harold Bull, the operations officer for Supreme Headquarters. And the crisis they faced was simple. 200,000 German troops had smashed through American lines in Belgium 3 days earlier. The German offensive had created a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied territory, threatening to split American and British forces and potentially reaching the vital port of Antwerp. And at the center of that bulge, the Belgian town of Bastogne was surrounded. 10,000 American soldiers were trapped there with limited ammunition, dwindling medical supplies, and no way out. Eisenhower looked exhausted. Bradley looked worried. Patton looked ready for a fight. The Supreme Commander asked the question that would determine everything. How quickly can you turn your army north and attack the German flank? Patton answered immediately. 48 hours. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Nobody in that room believed him. Not even Maddox, who had been planning this exact movement for 7 days, because what Patton had just promised was impossible. He was claiming he could take an entire army, approximately 100,000 troops, with over 133,000 vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, and rotate them 90 degrees, while those forces were actively engaged in combat against a different enemy to the south. Then move them over 100 miles north through winter weather on roads clogged with refugees. Then attack immediately, without pause for rest or reorganization. Military planning manuals said such a movement required 3 weeks minimum. Most commanders said it couldn't be done at all while maintaining combat readiness. One general later wrote that Patton's promise was either brilliant or insane, and nobody was sure which. But Maddox knew something the others didn't. The movement had already begun. Not officially, not on paper, but in dozens of small decisions made over the past week that would let Patton keep his impossible promise. What happened in the next 7 days would become one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. Not because Patton was a genius, though he was brilliant, but because his staff had done something that violated every principle of military orthodoxy. They had prepared for a battle they weren't ordered to fight, against an enemy that hadn't attacked yet, in a sector that wasn't their responsibility. And when the crisis came, they were ready. The first person who saw the German offensive coming was a lieutenant colonel named Oskar Koch. Koch was 3rd Army's intelligence officer, responsible for tracking enemy movements and predicting German intentions. He was methodical, cautious, and almost never wrong. On November 15, 1944, Koch noticed something strange in the intelligence reports from 1st Army sector to the north. The Germans were moving units, but not deploying them. Troops were arriving in the Ardennes region, but staying in reserve positions. Radio traffic had increased, but then suddenly stopped. Reconnaissance aircraft reported new supply dumps being established, but no corresponding offensive preparations. Koch tracked these anomalies systematically. His daily intelligence summaries documented the movement of specific German divisions. The 6th Panzer Army had disappeared from the front lines in early November. Radio intercepts suggested it was reforming somewhere behind the lines, but German communication discipline prevented precise location. The 1st SS Panzer Division, 2nd SS Panzer Division, and 12th SS Panzer Division had all vanished from their known positions. On December 9th, Koch issued his most explicit warning yet. His intelligence summary stated that the enemy was making every effort to employ armor in a coordinated thrust. He estimated German forces opposite 8th Corps at 30 divisions, far more than previously assessed. He noted that von Rundstedt had concentrated armor and infantry in the Ardennes sector at levels inconsistent with defensive operations. Most intelligence officers would have dismissed this as routine defensive repositioning. The Germans were losing the war. They were falling back toward their own borders. Defensive preparations made sense. Koch didn't think it was defensive. He thought it was a concentration for attack. He told Patton on November 26th, "The Germans are building up forces in the Ardennes. I think they're planning a counteroffensive." Patton listened. Patton always listened to Koch because Koch was usually right. But this time, the idea seemed crazy. The Germans didn't have the resources for a major offensive. They were defending on all fronts. Why would they risk everything on a winter attack through difficult terrain? Koch showed Patton the evidence. Increased rail traffic, the repositioning of the 6th Panzer Army, radio silence across entire divisions, all the signatures of offensive preparation. Patton made a decision that would save thousands of lives. He told Maddox to start planning, not officially, not on paper, just quiet staff work. If the Germans attack north of our sector, how fast can we disengage and move to counterattack? Maddox went to work. The problem wasn't just moving troops. The problem was that 3rd Army was actively fighting in the Saar region, preparing for its own offensive into Germany. Units were positioned for an eastward attack. Supply lines ran east. Communication networks faced east. Artillery was registered on targets to the east. To pivot 90 degrees north meant reversing everything while staying combat-ready. Maddox started with maps. He spread them across tables in the operations room and traced possible routes north. The roads were bad. Most were 2-lane highways built for farm traffic, not military convoys. Winter had turned fields into mud. Bridges might not support tank weight. And those roads would be clogged with civilians fleeing the German advance. Next came units. Which divisions could disengage fastest? Which ones were in positions that allowed clean withdrawal? Which ones had enough fuel and ammunition to fight immediately after arriving? 3rd Army had 3 corps under Patton's command. The 3rd Corps was positioned best for a northern move. It included the 4th Armoured Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division. Together, those 3 divisions had about 40,000 men and over 4,000 vehicles. On December 12th, 1 week before the Verdun conference, Patton told Maddox to prepare 3 separate contingency plans. Not one plan, 3. One for an attack with a single corps, one for a 2-corps attack, one for moving the entire 3rd Army. Maddox worked with his planning staff through the night. They identified 3 different assembly areas where troops could concentrate after moving north. They mapped 3 different axes of attack depending on where the Germans broke through. They calculated fuel requirements for each scenario. They determined how many supply trucks would be needed and where those trucks would come from. The planning was done in secret. If word got out that 3rd Army was preparing for a battle in 1st Army's sector, it would create confusion in the command structure. It might also give German intelligence a warning that Americans were expecting an attack. So Maddox told his staff they were conducting a planning exercise, a theoretical problem, not real operations. Some of them knew better. Chaplain James O'Neill, 3rd Army's chaplain, later wrote that he saw officers marking maps for northern movement days before the German attack, but nobody talked about it outside the operations room. On December 16th, at 05:30 hours, the German offensive began. Over 2,000 artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. Within hours, German armor had broken through American lines. Inexperienced divisions collapsed. Command posts were overrun. Communications failed. 3rd Army's morning briefing started at 0900. Koch reported the German attack. Estimated strength, 200,000 men, 3 armies, at least 7 panzer divisions. Direction of attack, westward toward the Meuse River and the city of Antwerp. Objective: split Allied forces and capture the main supply port. Patton asked about Bastogne. The town wasn't famous yet. Most officers had never heard of it. But Patton knew terrain and he knew logistics. Bastogne sat at a road junction where 7 highways converged. Any army trying to reach the Meuse had to either capture Bastogne or bypass it, and bypassing meant using minor roads that couldn't support heavy armor. Koch said Bastogne was being reinforced. The 101st Airborne Division was moving there from reserve. Estimated arrival, December 19th. That same day, December 16th, Patton told Maddox to activate the contingency plans. Not to execute them yet, just to activate them. Make sure division commanders know what might be required. Position units for rapid disengagement. Begin fuel and ammunition redistribution. Maddox sent coded messages to Corps headquarters. The messages used training language, but commanders understood. They started pulling units out of combat positions along the Saar. They consolidated supply dumps. They briefed their staff on northern routes. The official order hadn't come yet. Third Army was still fighting to the east, but Patton's forces were preparing to turn north. On December 18th, Patton received a call from Omar Bradley. "There's a meeting tomorrow in Verdun. Eisenhower wants you there. 1000 hours. Patton knew what that meant. The crisis was bad enough that the Supreme Commander was personally taking control, and Patton also knew what Eisenhower would ask. He would ask Third Army to disengage and counterattack. That evening, Patton held a conference with his senior staff. Maddox, Koch, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, the Chief of Staff, and Colonel Walter Muller, the logistics officer. They reviewed all 3 contingency plans. The smallest option was a single corps attack with 3 divisions. Fast to execute, limited impact. The medium option was 2 corps, 6 divisions. Stronger punch, longer preparation time. The largest option was the entire Third Army. Overwhelming force, but would take at least a week to coordinate. Patton asked Maddox which one could be ready fastest. Maddox said 3 divisions from 3rd Corps could attack in 48 hours if everything went perfectly. If nothing went wrong with fuel delivery, if roads stayed passable, if units disengaged cleanly, if German resistance during the move north was light. Patton said, "We'll promise 3 divisions in 48 hours. His staff looked at him like he was crazy. Moving 3 divisions, 100 miles, and attacking immediately was at the extreme edge of what was possible. And that assumed perfect conditions, which never happened in war. Winter weather alone could wreck the timetable. A single blown bridge could bottleneck the entire movement. Enemy air attacks could destroy fuel convoys. But Patton understood something his staff didn't fully appreciate yet. Speed was more valuable than perfection. If Third Army could hit the German flank even 1 day earlier, even with fewer forces than ideal, it would disrupt German planning and buy time for Allied forces in the north to organize. Better to attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours than 6 divisions in a week. That night, Maddox didn't sleep. He finalized movement orders for the 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, and 80th Infantry Division. He coordinated with Muller on fuel allocation. He arranged for engineers to prepare route signs. He sent advance parties to reconnaissance northern roads. At the Verdun conference on December 19th, when Eisenhower asked how fast Patton could attack, Patton gave the answer he'd prepared. 48 hours with 3 divisions. The room fell silent. Bradley, who knew Patton better than anyone, looked stunned. The other staff officers exchanged glances. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, checked his notes, as if confirming he'd heard correctly. Bradley spoke first. "George, I'd give yourself some leeway if I were you. This isn't the kind of operation you can rush." Montgomery, commanding British forces in the north, was more direct. He openly doubted it was possible. Moving an entire corps that distance while maintaining offensive capability simply violated too many principles of military logistics. He suggested a week minimum, preferably 10 days, but Eisenhower wasn't interested in caution. The Supreme Commander had just received the devastating reports from the Ardennes. American divisions were being overrun. The road to Antwerp lay open if the Germans could maintain momentum. Time mattered more than careful preparation. Eisenhower leaned forward and asked Patton directly, "Can you really do this in 48 hours? Or are you being optimistic?" Patton answered without hesitation, "I can attack on the morning of December 22nd with 3 divisions. My staff has already prepared the plans. My units are ready to move." Eisenhower studied Patton's face, looking for any sign of doubt or exaggeration. He found none. He ordered Patton to execute the plan. Patton left Verdun at 1300 hours and drove directly to 3rd Corps headquarters. He met with Major General John Milliken, the Corps commander, and gave him direct orders. "You're going to attack north toward Bastogne on December 22nd at 0600 hours. 4th Armored leads, 26th Infantry in the center, 80th Infantry on the right." Milliken asked about supplies. Patton said Muller was already moving fuel north. Artillery ammunition was being redistributed. Rations would catch up after the attack started. By 1800 hours on December 19th, 24 hours before the attack was supposed to begin, the movement was fully underway. Thousands of trucks rolled north on frozen roads. Artillery batteries disconnected from firing positions and hitched their guns to prime movers. Tank companies checked engines and track tension. Infantry companies loaded onto transport. The routes themselves presented enormous challenges. 3rd Corps would move through Luxembourg, but the Duchy's road network wasn't designed for military traffic of this scale. The main route ran through Thionville and Luxembourg City, then north toward Arlon. Alternate routes passed through smaller towns with narrower roads and weaker bridges. Military police established checkpoints every few miles to control traffic flow. Engineers inspected bridges before heavy vehicles crossed. When bridges couldn't support tank weight, engineers marked detours or rapidly constructed bypasses. In some locations, tanks had to cross fields rather than roads, tearing through frozen farmland while farmers watched helplessly. The weather was terrible. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Fog reduced visibility to less than 50 yards in places. Roads turned slick with ice. But the movement continued. Soldiers in the 4th Armored Division's maintenance and transport companies later described what the movement looked like. An endless column of vehicles stretching as far as you could see in both directions, headlights off because of air attack risk, trucks navigating by following the dim blackout lights of the vehicle ahead, drivers falling asleep at the wheel from exhaustion, crashes when vehicles slid off icy roads, but the column kept moving. The convoys passed through small French villages, where residents stood in doorways watching thousands of American vehicles flow north through their streets. Some villages had been liberated only months earlier. Now American troops were racing north to stop a new German offensive. The logistics were staggering. To move 3 divisions required over 11,000 vehicles. Those vehicles consumed thousands of gallons of fuel per hour. They traveled on roads that were also being used by supply convoys, heading to other units. Traffic control became critical. Colonel Muller, the logistics officer, set up fuel dumps along the northern routes before the divisions even arrived. He commandeered civilian fuel stocks from French municipalities. He arranged for fuel trucks to leapfrog ahead of combat units so tanks could refuel without stopping. Ammunition was harder. Each artillery piece needed shells positioned where it could reach them after deployment. Anti-tank guns needed armor-piercing rounds. Mortars needed high explosive. Machine guns needed belts of linked ammunition. All of it had to move north and arrive before the guns that would fire it. Muller coordinated ammunition movement with mathematical precision. He calculated burn rates for each weapon type. He estimated how much combat units would expend in the first 24 hours of fighting. He positioned ammunition dumps at 3 different locations, so units could resupply regardless of which route they took north. Communication was perhaps the most difficult challenge. When units moved, they left behind their wire networks. Field telephone lines couldn't be picked up and reinstalled fast enough to maintain contact during movement. Radio was unreliable in the Ardennes terrain. The solution was a dedicated courier network. Motorcycle riders carried orders between headquarters. Light aircraft flew message pouches when weather permitted. Runners on foot delivered orders to forward units when vehicles couldn't get through. All of this happened while Third Army was still fighting in the Saar. Some units were in active combat when they received orders to disengage. They had to break contact with the enemy, withdraw from positions, and begin moving north while under potential fire. The 80th Infantry Division was assaulting German positions near Saarbrücken when the movement order arrived. Division commander, Major General Horace McBride, later wrote that disengaging from combat was more dangerous than attacking. His units had to pull back from forward positions without giving Germans an opportunity to counterattack. They had to abandon prepared defensive positions and move into open terrain. They had to do all this at night in freezing weather. The 26th Infantry Division faced different challenges. Positioned near Metz, the division had been preparing for an attack eastward into the Siegfried Line. Artillery had registered targets to the east. Supply dumps were positioned for an eastward advance. When the order came to pivot 90 degrees north, every logistical arrangement had to be reversed. Division Commander Major General Willard Paul gave his regimental commanders 6 hours to disengage, reorganize, and begin moving. Artillery battalions had to break down firing positions, limber their guns, and join the movement. Infantry regiments had to leave their attack positions and march to assembly areas for truck transport. Engineer companies had to retrieve equipment from forward positions and prepare to support a completely different operation. The 4th Armoured Division had the shortest distance to travel but faced mechanical challenges. Many of the division's tanks and half-tracks had been in continuous operation for weeks. Track pads were worn, engines needed maintenance. Mechanical failures during the movement could strand entire companies on narrow roads. Division maintenance crews worked around the clock performing emergency repairs. Mechanics replaced worn tracks by flashlight. They changed oil and adjusted engine timing, while vehicles were queued for movement. They cannibalized damaged vehicles for parts to keep combat vehicles running. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Cohen, commanding an armoured infantry battalion, later estimated his maintenance platoon performed a month's worth of repairs in 36 hours. But they did it. By the morning of December 20th, all 3 divisions were moving north. Some units were ahead of schedule. Some were behind, but all were moving. Maddox tracked progress from 3rd Army headquarters using status reports that arrived every 2 hours. He maintained a master map showing division positions updated with coloured pins. When a unit reported a delay, Maddox adjusted other units to compensate. When a bridge was reported damaged, he rerouted traffic to alternate crossings. The weather got worse. On December 20th, snow began falling across Luxembourg. Roads that had been merely icy became snow-covered. Vehicle speeds dropped. Units that had been making 15 miles per hour slowed to 8 miles per hour. Patton personally drove the route to observe conditions. His driver, Master Sergeant John Mims, later described Patton as impatient and frustrated, but also focused. Patton stopped at checkpoints to talk with military police directing traffic. He visited division command posts to check on progress. He radioed Maddox with updates. At one point, Patton's jeep passed a stalled convoy of supply trucks blocking a narrow road. Patton jumped out and personally directed traffic to get the convoy moving. Soldiers who saw a 3-star general directing traffic like a military policeman were stunned. But Patton understood that every minute of delay meant Americans in Bastogne were closer to running out of ammunition. The situation in Bastogne was deteriorating. The 101st Airborne had arrived on December 19th and immediately found themselves surrounded. German forces began encircling the town on December 20th and completed the encirclement by noon on December 21st. American forces inside the perimeter included about 11,000 combat troops, plus several thousand support personnel and civilians. They had limited supplies. Ammunition for artillery was rationed, food was scarce, medical supplies were running low, and the weather prevented air resupply until December 23rd. On December 22nd, German forces sent a delegation under a flag of truce demanding American surrender. The ultimatum was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. McAuliffe's response became famous. Nuts. The German officers didn't understand the American slang. An American colonel had to explain that it meant go to hell. That same morning, December 22nd, at 0600 hours, Patton's counterattack began. 4th Armoured Division attacked up the western approach to Bastogne. 26th Infantry Division attacked in the center. 80th Infantry Division attacked on the eastern flank. The attack jumped off in darkness. American artillery opened with a preparation barrage at 05:45. Hundreds of guns fired in coordinated volleys, their muzzle flashes lighting up the pre-dawn sky. The barrage lasted 15 minutes, targeting known German positions along the attack routes. Then, at precisely 0600, the artillery shifted to rolling barrages ahead of advancing infantry. 3rd Corps attacked on a 25-mile front. Major General John Milliken positioned his command post in Luxembourg City, where he could maintain communication with all 3 divisions simultaneously. Radio nets crackled with reports as units crossed their lines of departure. Forward observers called for artillery support. Air liaison officers coordinated with fighter bombers waiting for daylight to strike German positions. Exactly 48 hours after Patton had made his promise at Verdun, the attack didn't go smoothly. German forces defending south of Bastogne were experienced and well-positioned. They had prepared defensive positions across likely approach routes. They used terrain effectively, positioning anti-tank guns on ridges covering road junctions. They fought stubbornly, making Americans pay for every mile of advance. 4th Armored Division was commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey. His division included 3 combat commands, flexible combined arms units, each with tanks, infantry, and artillery. Combat Command A attacked on the right, Combat Command B on the left. Combat Command Reserve held back initially. The division made slow progress. German resistance was fierce. Villages had to be cleared house by house. Roads were blocked with blown bridges and improvised obstacles. German artillery zeroed in on key terrain. The fighting around Bougainville on December 23rd demonstrated the challenges. Combat Command Reserve attacked the village at dawn. German paratroopers had fortified buildings and dug fighting positions in frozen ground. American tanks couldn't maneuver off the roads because deep snow concealed anti-tank mines. Infantry had to advance across open fields under machine gun fire. Combat Command A faced similar challenges attacking through Martelange. The town sat on high ground overlooking a river crossing. German forces had demolished the bridge and positioned anti-tank guns to cover the approaches. American engineers tried to build a bypass under fire. It took an entire day to secure a crossing, during which the division lost precious time. By December 23rd, 4th Armoured had advanced only 5 miles. Bastogne was still 20 miles away. At that rate of advance, relief would take another 4 days. The 101st Airborne didn't have 4 days. The weather changed on December 23rd. Fog lifted, skies cleared. Allied aircraft could finally fly. Transport planes began dropping supplies to Bastogne. Fighter bombers attacked German positions blocking 4th Armoured's advance. But clear weather also meant German aircraft could operate, and Luftwaffe fighters strafed American columns. Maddox watched reports from 3rd Army headquarters and realized the plan wasn't working fast enough. 3 divisions attacking on a broad front was methodical but slow. Bastogne needed a faster breakthrough. On December 24th, 4th Armoured changed tactics. Instead of advancing with all 3 combat commands online, the division concentrated Combat Command Reserve for a narrow penetration. The commander of Combat Command Reserve was Colonel Wendell Blanchard. Under Blanchard was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding 37th Tank Battalion. Abrams was 30 years old, a West Point graduate, already recognized as one of the best tank commanders in the Army. Patton once said, "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He's the world champion." Abrams led from the front in a Sherman tank he called Thunderbolt. He would go through 7 different tanks named Thunderbolt during the war, replacing each one as it was damaged or destroyed. He painted the name on the turret in large white letters so his men could always identify his position. On Christmas Day, December 25th, Abrams led his battalion in a concentrated assault toward the village of Assenois, 5 miles southwest of Bastogne. The attack was risky. A narrow thrust could be cut off and surrounded, but it was fast, and speed was what Bastogne needed. The assault started in darkness. Tank engines roared in the frozen air. Infantry rode on the backs of tanks and inside half-tracks. Artillery fired a preparation barrage, then lifted to let the armour advance. The attack axis ran directly through Assenois, which sat astride the only usable road to Bastogne from the southwest. German paratroopers had fortified the village heavily. They positioned anti-tank guns in stone buildings that provided excellent fields of fire. They planted mines on the approaches. They established machine gun positions covering every intersection. American artillery pounded Assenois for 20 minutes before the assault. Over 2,000 rounds hit the village, setting buildings ablaze and creating massive clouds of smoke and dust. But when the barrage lifted and Abrams's tanks moved forward, German defenders emerged from cellars and began fighting. German defenders fought hard. They knocked out several American tanks with anti-tank guns positioned in Assenois. The first Sherman to enter the village was hit in the turret by an 88mm round that killed the entire crew. A second tank threw a track on debris and had to be abandoned. They used Panzerfaust rockets fired from buildings at ranges under 50 yards. They fought house to house, making Americans clear each structure. But Abrams kept pushing. When his lead tanks were hit, he brought up more. When infantry bogged down, he committed reserves. He personally directed fire from Thunderbolt, engaging German positions at close range. At one point, Abrams's tank destroyed a German self-propelled gun at 1,000 yards with a single shot from his 76mm gun. By mid-afternoon on December 26th, Abrams's battalion had broken through Assenois. The village was in American hands, but still under artillery fire from German positions to the east and west. The road to Bastogne was open, but the corridor was narrow, under fire from both sides, and could collapse at any moment. Abrams chose Lieutenant Charles Bogus to lead the final dash into Bastogne. Bogus commanded an M4 A3E2 Sherman assault tank called Cobra King. The Cobra King was a jumbo variant with extra armor on the front, designed to absorb hits from German anti-tank guns. Bogus was 32 years old. 3 days earlier, his previous tank commander had been killed by a sniper while standing in the turret. Bogus had taken over the tank and the command. At 1600 hours on December 26th, Bogus led a column of tanks and half-tracks toward Bastogne at maximum speed. American artillery fired over their heads at German positions on the flanks. Fighter bombers strafed ahead of the column. Cobra King's crew could see supply parachutes hanging in trees around Bastogne from airdrops. The column raced through the last village between Assenois and Bastogne, taking fire from buildings but not stopping. Infantry and half-tracks fired back with machine guns. Tanks fired their main guns at any German position they saw. The column kept moving. At 1650 hours, Cobra King reached the American defensive perimeter at Bastogne. Bogus saw soldiers in American uniforms, but wasn't sure if they were genuine or Germans in captured uniforms. German infiltrators wearing American uniforms had been causing confusion throughout the battle. Bogus shouted from his tank turret, "Who are you?" A lieutenant stepped forward. "I'm Lieutenant Webster, 326th Engineers, 101st Airborne. Glad to see you." The siege was broken. 4 hours and 50 minutes later, Abrams arrived and shook hands with General McAuliffe. The corridor to Bastogne was open, though it was narrow and under fire. Engineers would spend the rest of the night clearing German stragglers from the woods on both sides of the road. But breaking the siege was only the beginning. The corridor was less than a mile wide and under constant German artillery fire. Supply convoys trying to reach Bastogne had to run a gauntlet of German positions on both flanks. Ambulances evacuating wounded took fire from German machine guns positioned in the woods. Third Army immediately began widening the corridor. The 26th Infantry Division attacked from the east to push German forces back from the road. The 80th Infantry Division attacked from the west. 4th Armoured Division continued pressing north beyond Bastogne to create more breathing room. The fighting to widen and secure the corridor lasted another 3 weeks. German forces launched repeated counterattacks, trying to cut the corridor and re-encircle Bastogne. On January 3, 1945, German armour attacked the corridor from both sides simultaneously in a coordinated effort to sever American supply lines. The attack was repulsed, but demonstrated German determination to recapture the town. The relief cost 4th Armoured Division about 1,000 men killed and wounded. 37th Tank Battalion lost 5 men killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing. But Bastogne was relieved in 7 days, faster than any conventional military planning would have predicted. And more importantly, the relief had been achieved while Third Army maintained offensive operations on 2 separate axes, something military planners had considered impossible. The German reaction to Patton's movement was confusion, followed by alarm. German intelligence had tracked Third Army's positions through radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations. They knew Third Army was positioned for an attack into the Saar. German commanders had assessed that Third Army was too heavily engaged to respond to the Ardennes offensive. When Third Army suddenly appeared attacking north toward Bastogne, German commanders were caught completely off guard. They had planned for Allied counterattacks from the north but not from the south. They had positioned reserves to block Montgomery's forces, but hadn't expected Patton to disengage from active combat and reposition so quickly. The German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division bore the brunt of 4th Armoured Division's assault. Its commander, Colonel Ludwig Heilmann, had positioned his 16,000 paratroopers to block the approaches to Bastogne from the south. His division had been successful in slowing the American advance for several days. But Heilmann's forces were spread thin across too wide a front, and he lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons to stop concentrated armor attacks. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the west, later wrote that Patton's movement was militarily impossible, according to German staff calculations. Moving an army of that size while maintaining combat effectiveness should have required 2 to 3 weeks. The fact that Americans did it in 48 hours fundamentally disrupted German operational planning. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, said the rapid American response forced him to divert forces intended for the drive toward the Meuse River. Instead of concentrating his armor for breakthrough, he had to position divisions defensively to protect his southern flank from Patton's counterattack. The 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division, which had been racing west toward the Meuse, had to halt their advance and shift south to contain Third Army's thrust. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. For 2 weeks, they had been advancing, pushing Americans back, creating a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. They believed they were winning. Then suddenly, American forces appeared in strength on their flank, attacking with overwhelming firepower. German morale collapsed in some units. Prisoners interrogated after December 26th reported that their officers had told them American forces in the south were fully committed and couldn't respond to the Ardennes offensive. When American tanks appeared at Bastogne, those soldiers realized they had been lied to. If German intelligence was wrong about American dispositions, what else was wrong? The weather also turned against the Germans. Clear skies that began on December 23rd allowed Allied air forces to operate at full strength. Fighter bombers attacked German supply columns, medium bombers struck railheads and fuel dumps, heavy bombers destroyed bridges across the Rhine that German forces needed for reinforcement and withdrawal. By early January 1945, the German offensive had stalled. American forces under Patton from the south and Montgomery from the north began squeezing the Bulge. German units that had penetrated deepest into Allied territory found themselves in danger of encirclement. Hitler ordered them to hold position and fight to the last man, but by mid-January, German forces were in full retreat. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States Army over 80,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. It was the bloodiest battle Americans fought in Europe, but it also destroyed the last significant German offensive capability. The German army expended its strategic reserves, lost thousands of irreplaceable tanks and vehicles, and never recovered. Patton's movement to Bastogne demonstrated what later military theorists would call operational mobility, the ability to rapidly shift forces from one sector to another while maintaining combat readiness. It required detailed planning, efficient logistics, excellent communication, and aggressive leadership at every level from army command down to individual units. But it also required something that couldn't be taught in military schools. It required a willingness to prepare for battles that might not happen, to divert resources to contingency planning that might never be executed, to trust that the time and effort spent on hypothetical operations would be worthwhile if the crisis came. Maddox and his staff had spent 7 days preparing plans for a German offensive that intelligence suggested but hadn't confirmed. They worked on operations that weren't officially authorized. They positioned forces and supplies for a battle in someone else's sector. By conventional military standards, that was wasteful and potentially insubordinate. But when the crisis came, Third Army was ready. The official recognition came slowly. Eisenhower personally thanked Patton for the relief of Bastogne. Bradley called the movement a remarkable achievement. Montgomery, who had initially doubted the plan was possible, later acknowledged that Third Army's rapid response had prevented a German breakthrough to the Meuse, but Maddox never received the public credit he deserved. His name appears in official histories as Third Army Operations Officer, but the details of his planning work remained classified for years. The contingency plans he developed weren't declassified until the 1960s. Colonel Muller, the logistics officer who coordinated fuel and ammunition movement, also received little recognition. His after-action reports detailed the challenges of sustaining an army during rapid movement, but they were filed away in archives and rarely studied. The division commanders, corps commanders, and tank battalion leaders received medals and commendations. Patton received most of the credit and most of the glory. That was how the system worked. Generals in the field got the recognition. Staff officers in headquarters did the work that made victory possible, but remained anonymous. Halley Maddox continued as Third Army Operations Officer through the end of the war. He planned the subsequent operations that drove German forces back to the Rhine, then across the Rhine into Germany itself. After the war, he served as Chief of Staff for the occupation forces in Germany. He retired as a Major General in 1959. He never talked much about Bastogne. When asked about the rapid movement, he credited Patton's leadership and the dedication of the soldiers who executed the plan. He minimized his own role, saying he just did his job, which was to turn Patton's vision into orders that units could execute. Creighton Abrams went on to become one of the most respected officers in the United States Army. He commanded forces in Vietnam from 1968 to 1972. He served as Army Chief of Staff from 1972 until his death in 1974. The M1 Abrams tank was named in his honor. Charles Bogus, the lieutenant who led Cobra King into Bastogne, returned to civilian life after the war. He rarely spoke about his role in the relief. In interviews years later, he said he was just doing what hundreds of other tank commanders were doing that day, trying to get to Bastogne before the 101st Airborne ran out of ammunition. Anthony McAuliffe, who gave the famous nuts reply, became a lieutenant general and commanded the 7th Army in Europe, but he spent the rest of his life answering questions about that single word, spoken in frustration during the worst crisis of the siege. The broader lessons of Bastogne weren't fully appreciated until decades later. Military theorists studying the battle focused on Patton's aggressive leadership and the courage of American soldiers. They analyzed the tactical decisions and the impact of air support, but they often missed the quieter achievement, the staff work that made rapid movement possible, the logistics planning that kept forces supplied during winter operations, the communication systems that maintained coordination across 3 divisions, moving independently, the contingency planning that began a week before the crisis occurred. That kind of preparation doesn't make for dramatic stories. It's not cinematic. It's officers studying maps at 2 a.m. It's logistics calculations showing fuel burn rates and ammunition expenditure. It's communication plans, mapping radio frequencies and courier routes. But wars are won in these quiet moments of professional competence as much as in dramatic battlefield actions. Modern military doctrine now includes the concept that Maddox demonstrated at Bastogne: anticipatory planning for contingencies that haven't developed yet, maintaining flexible forces that can rapidly reposition, building logistics systems that can sustain operations during movement, creating command structures that can coordinate without constant direct control. The United States Army now trains specifically for the kind of operation Patton executed in December 1944. It's called operational maneuver. It's taught at staff colleges and war colleges. It's practiced in exercises and simulations. Students study Patton's pivot as a case study in rapid force repositioning under combat conditions. The principles came from Third Army in the winter of 1944, from a staff that prepared for a battle they weren't ordered to fight, from a logistics system that sustained forces during rapid movement, from commanders at every level who understood that speed and aggression could overcome numerical disadvantages. Victory came not just through individual acts of heroism, though those mattered, not just through brilliant tactical decisions, though those helped. It came through thousands of small professional decisions made by officers and soldiers who took their jobs seriously, even when nobody was watching. That was the real lesson of Bastogne. The photograph that hangs in the National Museum of the United States Army shows General Patton awarding General McAuliffe the Distinguished Service Cross. It was taken on January 14, 1945, outside Bastogne. Patton is in his characteristic pose, hands on hips, ivory-handled pistols visible. McAuliffe is at attention, clearly exhausted but proud. In the background of that photograph, barely visible, stands Brigadier General Halley Maddox. He's not in the center of the image. He's not looking at the camera. He's holding a clipboard, probably reviewing movement orders for the next operation. That's where he belonged. Not in the spotlight, but in the background, making sure the next movement would work as well as the last one. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.